Welcome to the United Church of Christ annual Juneteenth celebration. Your presence today is a gift to the United Church of Christ. Today, you'll be immersed in an African tradition of storytelling. You'll also be invited into the village as listeners to the deep journeys, valleys, and mountaintop experiences of our esteemed panelists. As people of the African diaspora, our stories are layered with the intersections of our ancestry, connection to the land we were birthed on and currently live on. And our sacred families are planted in our bodies. We who believe in the God of creation and the spirit of liberation. We believe in the value of all humanity, and we protect and encourage the next generation. This year, during this celebration, we want to honor the grandmother of Juneteenth, Opal Lee. She is known as the Person of the Year for her significant influence and the impact of the community that has surrounded her to make sure that Juneteenth was a federal holiday. We also want to acknowledge the gift of our living ancestors who encouraged Opal, because over 40 years it took Opal to move the nation and Congress into a space where Juneteenth would become a national holiday. And she fought to ensure that Juneteenth would not just be an equality remembrance and celebration for just communities of people of color or African Americans, but Opal believed that Juneteenth belonged to everyone. It was everyone's history. And even at 95 years old, Opal Lee is showing no signs of stopping her journey. Her life story includes her famous trek from Fort Worth, Texas to Washington, D.C., to call on lawmakers to make Juneteenth a national holiday. She is our legendary living ancestor. And in the words of Opal Lee, people think it's a Black thing when it's not. It's not even a Texas thing. Juneteenth means freedom, and I mean freedom for everybody. And I have to tell you that none of us are free until we are all free. Let us pray. Creator of heaven and earth, we come on this day. We come this day to honor the ancestors. We come this day to honor those who lived in enslaved bodies, but were free people. And so we offer this prayer. Stony the road we trod, bitter the chastening rod, felt in the days when hope unborn had died. Yet with a steady beat, have not our weary feet come to the place for which our fathers sighed? We have come over a way that with tears have been watered. We come treading our path through the blood of the slaughtered, out of the gloomy past, till now we stand at last, where the white gleam of our bright star is cast. God of our weary years, God of our silent tears, thou who hast brought us thus far on the way, thou who hast by thy might led us into the light forever, keep us in the path we pray, lest our feet stray from the places, our God, where we met thee, lest our hearts drunk with the wine of the world, we forget thee. Shadowed beneath thy hand, may we forever stand, true to our God and true to our native land. Amen. We are grateful to have with us to share in this experience our host, our sister, the beloved Dr. Renee K. Harrison. Renee, which she has asked that we call her after many encounters, is a teacher, an author, and a scholar. I tagged on, she is a cultural historian and a truth teller with many stories that she'll share with us today. Dr. Harrison's research interests include an interdisciplinary and interfaith approach to African American religious history and culture, an early American religious history, Black feminist and womanist thought, and an aesthetic theory and the arts. She practices rituals of healing and resistance. Renee is an associate professor of African American and US religious history at Howard University. She joined the School of Divinity faculty in the fall of 2010. Her research includes an interdisciplinary and interfaith approach that combines Black feminist and womanist thought. She is also the recipient of many awards, grants, and fellowships. She is the co-facilitator with Dean Yolanda Pierce of the Community, Spirituality, and the Arts series at Howard University School of Divinity. She is also the author of Enslaved Women and the Art of Resistance in Antebellum America, engaged teaching in theology and religion, who she co-authored that particular work with Dr. Jeannie Knight from the University of Virginia. Renee's most recent publication is Black Hands, White House, Slave Labor and the Making of America, which has been released, and those resources are available for you to purchase. We are overwhelmed and overjoyed, and we are excited to have her as our host. She is not only just a cultural historian, but she comes from the soil of the ancestors, and we welcome her. The Reverend, I tagged that on there, Dr. Renee K. Harrison, welcome.
I'm so glad to be here. You tagged on Reverend. I'll take it, even though I am ordained. I just don't share it. Hello, everyone. Welcome, and many thanks for this opportunity to be your host and in-house historian. I hope everyone is just excited to be here because there's so many great stories. I mean, I was listening to it all last night. I mean, it's just so many great stories, and you're going to be in such a treat. I'm grateful to be here with you today. I want to personally thank Velda Love, Sharon Finema, Andrea Burse for building the bridge and bringing this event into a reality. What an event. The power of sharing stories. Today, we are addressing our panelists by their given first names out of respect for their parents, being mindful to name their children. Naming ceremonies are a part of many African traditions that signify children are sacred, they belong to God, and have a place within the village, community, and the earth. Speaking one's name out loud means I see you, respect, and I hear you. Our panelists are sacred human beings. You're going to find that out today if you don't already know. Made in the image and likeness of God. And so let me also say I'm grateful to be among the panelists, persons whom I have respected throughout my journey. Each of your stories, I must say, remind me how important it is that we as Black people remain vigilant in telling our stories, stories which are a part of the American story. But let me be honest here. I must admit, as a historian and sojourner with the ancestors, seeing Juneteenth as a celebratory occasion is a bit bittersweet for me. On one end, I'm ever mindful of the earnest work that went into making Juneteenth a national holiday. Velda has expressed that in great detail about the retired teacher Opal, who worked relentlessly. She went in relentless pursuit to make sure that this holiday that we are enjoying. I know federal people are excited because they get 4 days off, but I want to focus on the event at hand. That you have the opportunity to take part in an event that is centered around the celebration of freedom. So I'm mindful of that. But I also want to point us this importance in terms of story. What happens when we embrace a single story narrative about Juneteenth? And so this single story narrative about Juneteenth, the populist account, I'm going to remind us as we frame today, is framed around the story of Confederate General Edmund Kirby Smith surrendering to Union troops at Galveston, Texas on June 2nd. As the story goes, Union General Gordon Granger and his troops rode into Texas on June 19, 1865, and made their way to Galveston with General Order Number 3. Granger read the order granting Black people freedom from involuntary servitude. Now, some versions of the story indicate that Blacks in Galveston were unaware that they were free until the general read the order. And once read, they celebrated. And each year following, they held celebrations in remembrance of freedom. Those celebrations became known as Juneteenth. But when we peel back the layers of this populist account, we are faced with the hidden and egregious aspects of the story. First is the notion that even though Black people in Texas and throughout the states were fighting in the war, this notion that Black people did not know they were free until the general, a white man, told them. This version of the stories presupposes that Black people were ignorant, unaware, and lacked agency. Second, this egregious and hidden aspect of the story overlooks the fact that Black people were free before the reading of the order because of the Emancipation Proclamation that went into effect in 1863. Their slave owners chose not to free them and instead made them work for nearly 2 years more so they could capitalize off their labors. Now, for me, there is nothing celebratory about that aspect of the story. And though a separate account, but aligned to our discussion today and the stories you will hear, we fail when we rely on the single story account. We fail as a nation to talk about and make amends for the lands Union officers gave enslaved Black people during the war as they overtook the Confederate States. Black people received government-owned lands and enjoyed the fruits of their labors, raised families, built homes, and felt present in the world after slavery until that dreadful day when the lands were taken away. The Compromise of 1877 changed it all. And in that compromise, Southern landowners demanded their land back, and the government conceded to displacing millions of Black people. So Juneteenth is bittersweet because hiding in the celebration of the single story is a larger story about entitlement and being Black and harmed in America. Now that you've heard me speak about the danger of ignoring a single story and the value I hope we find today by expanding the story and listening to those that were once marginalized and unable to tell their story, to hear what the descendants have to say. It's time for us to turn our attention to the hidden histories among us today. And I believe Each of our individual stories, when woven together, will provide us awareness, richness, and texture to our discussion today on land, lineage, family, emancipation, and visions for reshaping a better tomorrow. We begin our journey today in Virginia. Our journey to hearing more hidden stories, we begin in the state of Virginia, the first colony in mainline North America that did not abolish slavery until 1865. Enslaved Black people accounted for 1/3 of Virginia's population by the time slavery ended. Enslaved Blacks in Virginia, like many other regions, did not wait for an order number 3 to be read. They did not wait for an order or a white man to tell them they were free. They took it upon themselves to run to freedom. During the war, thousands escaped to places like Norfolk and Fort Monroe. It was Norfolk that became known as one of the most famous pit stops along the Underground Railroad, a secret network that helped Black people escape to freedom. So now let us hear a hidden history on land, lineage, family life, and emancipation from Yvonne Delk.
The oldest daughter of Marcus and Cordell, and of course, there were 3 things that were so important to our life in Norfolk, Virginia. If we were going to survive as a family that really believed deeply in faith, and a family that deeply believed that for every child that they had, they want to empower them with a rich sense of self-affirmation and a feeling that you are, in fact, as good as anybody else. And we want you to feel that sense of worth and dignity. And it passed on from my family to my teachers, everybody around us in the African community was just pouring love and affirmation and support and encouragement to us, and also always giving us accolades over and over again. I was growing up at a time that people kept saying to me, "We see something in you." I never understood quite what they meant. But I grew up with a grandmother on my mother's side and a great-grandmother on my mother's side who had the amazing ability to do what I call flowing the boundaries. They lived in the spirit world, and their ability to communicate and to see things flowed the various boundaries that contain us, that keep us from seeing and keep us from being conceived. My grandmother Ella, they received that affirmation from Africa, that was an African gift that had been passed on from one to the other. And since I was the oldest living daughter of Marcus and Cordell, felt that the spirit was also with me. My grandmother, my great-grandmother Lucy and my grandmother Ella, they were always connected to the land, and the land for them produced that which we needed to survive from. My grandmother and my great-grandmother had gardens, and they had flower gardens, and they had healing gardens. When I had a problem that I had to deal that was of medicine, we didn't always have all of the income to go to a doctor to really be able to treat all the ailments we had, but they knew exactly the herbs that they could get from those gardens and use those herbs that were healing medicines for whatever it was that was ailing us. And so I grew up with mothers and grandmothers who were deeply connected to the land, both for flowers, for healing, and for food. And so I felt that the water and that the land that was around me was life-giving. And I also felt at the same time that they were struggling to help me and my siblings to figure out how to survive in the midst of a system that was so inhumane. And they poured all of their love into us. And one of the affirmations that they kept saying to us, it doesn't matter. And this is an African proverb, what they call you is what you answer to that matters. And they were teaching us to answer to strength, to answer to our affirmation, to answer to our faith, to answer to the gifts that were within us, and to answer to that call to be the very best that we could be. And so I grew up struggling with a racist system, yes, but at the same time supported by a whole company of mothers and grandparents who kept pouring life into me. I knew that there was going to be a moment that I had to, in fact, break through in a very special way. And that moment came when we made a decision that we would challenge the segregated system of Norfolk, Virginia. It was my first time deciding that I would no longer live in silence in a system that was so dehumanizing. And when the call came, and they had already started in North Carolina to desegregate, and when they were sitting in at the lunch counters, et cetera, and it came to my school in my senior year of college. And I was grateful at that moment. I drew strength from the Mary Peels. I grew strength from the Rosa Parks. I grew strength from my mother, my grandmother, my great-grandmother, all of them who poured their spirits into me to say, you got to stand for what you believe in. They had already infused that into my being. And so it was my breakout moment. I sat in those, we trained. They said that it has to be done nonviolently. If you don't think you can go downtown in Norfolk, Virginia and sit at the counters and Woolworths and protest in a nonviolent way, this is not for you. And so they took us through rehearsal after rehearsal, calling us names and pulling us off of the benches and having us come back at it. And sometimes I thought, I can't do this. I want to fight back if somebody's pulling me off and knocking me down. But I thought of the courage, and I thought about these women's spirits that were pouring their spirits into me. And it made it possible for me to get my courage together and to be among the early ones at Norfolk State, to march straight downtown to Woolworths, take my seat at the lunch counter and protest the system that I had grown up with in my life, fighting for a new moment in life in town. It was my breakthrough moment. And I was there in this land that I had been born in, where the ancestors had come. I was right there in all of those places where my mothers and fathers and grandparents had poured life into me, fighting for the world that they intended. It was my Juneteenth.
Wow. Wow. Thank you so much, Yvonne Delp, as you give us the sustenance that you received from the Sisters of the Yam, as Bell Hooks would so eloquently call it. We move from Norfolk, Virginia, and continue our journey to hearing more hidden histories, traveling a short distance to the District of Columbia. Carved out between two states, Virginia and Maryland, the District of Columbia was not only once known as Federal City, but the great man market of the nation. DC was one of the most active slave depots in the US. Slavery ended in the nation's capital in 1862. The bill abolishing slavery in the district was not named the DC Emancipation Act. No, it was named the DC Compensated Act. The government allocated slave owners $1,000 if they were loyal to the Union and paid them up to $300 per enslaved person residing and working within the district and nearby areas like Virginia and Maryland, which our next speaker will so gladly usher us into. Black people were now free in the district, but received no monetary or land compensation from the US government for their years of service. So now, let us hear a hidden history on land, lineage, family life, and emancipation in DC from Bernice Powell Jackson.
So I was born in Washington, D.C., in the nation's capital, with that history that Renee so eloquently shared with us. And to be exact, I was born in Freedmen's Hospital, on the campus of Howard University. That's Howard University behind Renee. And I was a Brown versus Board of Education baby, in that I went to the very first year of integrated schools in the nation's capital because the nation's capital was segregated. And by the time I graduated from high school, of the 497 in my class, 492 of us were Black. I grew up in a Black community and a Black church, People's Congregational Church to be exact. And there were in that community and in that church doctors and lawyers and professors and architects and engineers. And that's framed my life in many ways. But fast forward to a few weeks after the November 2008 election, which was quite honestly the very first time that I felt really and truly an American. Sometime in high school or college, I had stopped reciting the last line of the Pledge of Allegiance, you know, the one that goes with liberty and justice for all, because I didn't believe it. I didn't see it. But after President Obama's election, I started saying that line too. But in this day in 2008, I was in Little Zion Baptist Church in Greenville, Virginia. It's a church that my mother's relatives had helped to build. And outside the church windows, I could see the gravestones of my grandmother. And I'm going to name them because you're right, names are important. Nanny Colvin Nickens and my grandfather, Frederick Douglass Nickens, named for the great speaker and freedom fighter. And I could see the graves of my great-grandparents and other relatives. And as I sat there preparing to speak at the funeral of my mother's last living sibling, I thought about the stories that I had been told about our family, some of them funny and others of them tragic. And I thought about the Virginia reddish brown clay on the dirt road that wound past that church down to my grandparents' home. And I thought about the church fellowship hall next door to the sanctuary that had originally been the one-room schoolhouse. That was the only school that my mother had attended. She had only gone to 8th grade. And what went through my mind and my heart that day were the words, "We belong here. We belong here." Words that had been denied to African Americans and other people of color in this nation for centuries. On this land that my relatives had lived on for at least 4 generations. I knew that we belong here. And that's what I shared with them that day. That our family that had lived there for generations belonged to that land just as that land belonged to us. Greenville, Virginia is a little place about 35 miles southwest of Washington, D.C. But when my mother, Bernice Virginia Fletcher, I was named for my mom, was growing up, it was a settlement of Blacks and whites who, although they occupied adjoining land, they lived separately. That's why my mother and the older children of her family never went to high school. My grandparents, who had 12 children, had survived the Great Depression by my grandfather working as a carpenter and bricklayer in Washington, D.C., building some of those most elegant homes and running a small grocery store in the back of their house. They had a small garden, which they kept all of their lives. And somehow, some way, with God, they survived. My father, whose name was Otis Fletcher, was born in Washington, D.C., but his family came from the next county over from my mother's family in Virginia. His father, whose name was Channing Fletcher, was the son of a white man and a Black woman who worked for him. And his maternal grandmother, Virginia Flanagan, was an Irish immigrant who was married to a Black man. family was now living in Washington, and he spent his life working for the Postal Service and then served at Tuskegee Air Force Base, running that post office there during World War II. And then he worked in the US State Department until he died at the early age of 54. So my family's roots on both sides are deep in the red soil of Northern Virginia. My parents' lives were prescribed by being Black in America. My mother's education was very limited, and my father's income and work status were also limited solely because he was Black. But here's the thing. These were not names in history books, but these are real people in my lifetime. This has impact in my lifetime. You see, Juneteenth and the legacy of slavery isn't just what happened long ago. It's what has impelled me to do what I do. It's had an impact in my lifetime, and it has an impact today and will tomorrow. Because let's be clear, we as a nation are not yet emancipated.
Wow, Bernice Johnson Powell, that felt like a Hush Harbor moment, a hush. Calling of the names of your grandparents, remembering the work of their hands, the building, the stores. We belong here. We belong here. We belong here. As we continue our journey to hearing more hidden histories, we travel from DC through the tobacco fields in North Carolina, then across the waters, retracing the movement of that tobacco and people by way of the transatlantic slave trade. Slavery ended in North Carolina after the Emancipation Proclamation went into effect on January 1st, 1863. Tobacco production put North Carolina on the map, making it a powerhouse due to the ingenuity of an enslaved man named Stephen. You heard Bernice usher in the names of those that are not in the history books, and we're going to add one more today. Stephen. Did you know in 1839, Stephen developed a process for curing yellow bright leaf tobacco on his owner's farm in Coswell County. His method was so ingenious that it spread to places like Durham and Winston, which later became known as Winston-Salem. It became so popular that it was the main tobacco that was relied upon by the soldiers during the Civil War. Tobacco production and the trading of Black people and cash crops collectively fueled European expansion into the New World. Because the demand for cash crops and Black people was so high at different junctures in different regions, it was not uncommon for slave owners to buy and sell their cash crops and human commodities between and within the Americas, West Indies, Africa, and Europe. Black people, no doubt, were scattered throughout the diaspora, which is what you're going to hear from our next speakers. They were living in more than one region at a time in their lifetime. So now let us hear two hidden histories on land, lineage, family life, emancipation from Christine and Dennis Wiley.
I was born at 10 o'clock a.m. on Sunday, July 9th, 1950, at the Kate Bidding Reynolds Memorial Hospital in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. This hospital that was built in 1938 in a southern city, such as Winston-Salem, known for its mass production of popular tobacco commodities, like Winston and Salem cigarettes, manufactured by the R.J. Reynolds Tobacco Company, that was built for the distinct purpose of, and that's the hospital again, the distinct purpose of serving Black patients separate and apart from white patients. Fortunately, even though this hospital was created to perpetuate racial segregation and discrimination, the well-prepared Black doctors, nurses, and technicians who were hired by the hospital delivered outstanding service to the Black community. And even though this hospital was eventually replaced by the interracial Reynolds Memorial Hospital in Winston-Salem in 1970, I am proud to have been delivered by Black medical professionals in what had swiftly become one of the largest and most outstanding Black hospitals in America. Growing up in Winston-Salem, from the day of my birth until our family moved to Washington, D.C. in June 1964, was a relatively positive experience for me, despite what was going on around me. And the reason I say that is because much of the African-American population in Winston-Salem at that time, the majority, the significant majority, was in what was called East Winston. And so that's where I grew up. My father being a pastor at Friendship Baptist Church in Winston-Salem from 1947 to 52.
Well, my experience is a little different, going kind of across the diaspora, in that my mother was a first generation British-born Black person. Her mother's family had immigrated from Germany to London. They were Jewish, pretending to be Christians. And my grandmother married a man from Trinidad. So she was pretty ostracized by her family. My father, his name was Reginald Melville, and he was from Guyana, but was raised in Trinidad. And so he came to London as a merchant marine. And my mother's father was also an immigrant from Trinidad. So so there seems to be, quite an international Caribbean thing, that was going on here. And, but, my father, he immigrated to the United States and left my mother with me in London, but my mother married an American serviceman, which had us here in the United States. And so, she married someone from Hattiesburg, Mississippi. And, we were a military family. And one of the things that really hit me was that we were stationed in California. So we would go and drive by car from California to Mississippi in the 50s. And there was no place we could stay. We had to, just stop on at roadside parks, and I remember my father, when he had to get gas, he would stop to check out the restrooms to see if it was like a hole in the ground. And if it was, then we wouldn't buy gas there, so, and my mother was so frightened because she really wasn't used to the United States and all of the racism, because at that time in Great Britain, it was more of the class issues. So she made my father, when he was driving, wear his military uniform. And we had a sticker on the car that said, "We are an Air Force family." We had the Green Book that would tell us, you know, where to go and where to stay, that kind of thing, because we couldn't, you know, we couldn't really stay in a hotel or anything.
So, so it's just interesting, the whole, and when we lived in Winston-Salem, in East Winston, I didn't know any better but to think that, okay, this is wonderful. And it was, we were comfortable and we were safe, but I was not aware as a young boy living there from 1 to 14 of just how much luxury was in other areas of the city and that metropolitan area. And one of the reasons it did not affect me too much was because we had expert, wonderful teachers, and neighbors were wonderful, who looked out for each other. You've heard this saying, it takes a village or a whole village to raise a child. And so I never felt, and even though some of the things, of course, that we experienced was that as peaceful and pleasant and relatively progressive as Winston-Salem was, I eventually discerned that I was born and raised in a community and culture in which so-called colored people were second-class citizens. We were socially expected and usually legally compelled to live in a world of segregation that included the neighborhoods in which we lived, the schools we attended, the libraries we visited, the stores, restaurants, movie theaters, swimming pools, recreation centers, and county fairs we patronized. And often we patronized it a week after the white people had patronized it, and we had to take the leftovers at that particular time. And the public transportation, restrooms, water fountains, all of those kind of things were separate that we used. And even the churches we joined, of course, were for the most part Black churches. But that's where we got our inspiration. That's where we were able to be revived and to allow ourselves to face another day, another week, another year, etc. So I never felt deprived. I never felt that I lacked anything until I left North Carolina and realized that things were a little bit different. But I'm thankful for the education I received there and for the people that nurtured us while we were there.
Yeah, and I think for me, you know, being able to visit a number of times Hattiesburg, Mississippi, what I noticed was that was the only place where there were all Black people, you know, because where I was living was always on a military installation, which was always predominantly white. One of the things that I was, you know, proud of was some of the stories, you know, that when Martin Luther King came to Hattiesburg, Mississippi, he stayed in my grandmother's house, you know. Also the land of that the family church was on, Morning Star Baptist Church, which is still there in Hattiesburg, Mississippi. It was donated by the family, you know, to the church. So one of the things that I realized in kind of going back to Hattiesburg and being able to experience the Black church for the first time. So we would come back from Hattiesburg to California and we would play church because we had never experienced anything like that before, you know, within the white church. But also, you know, we were, I went to high school in Germany, and so still there weren't that many Black people there. And so one of the things that I said to myself is, when I go to college, I want to be able to walk down the hallways and see other Black people. You know, I want to I want to experience that. And so that's what had me going to Howard University. You know, I was very intentional about wanting to go to an HBCU, because what Dennis experienced in terms of coming up within the Black community and then seeing something wider, I experienced the wider first, you know, and then saw what I was missing within the Black community.
Mhm.
Thank you, Christine and Dennis Wiley. How rich of a message that our roots are so deeply entwined and connected. I want to see someone who looks like me, she says. We come as far and deep and wide as Europe, as Africa, the West Indies, and the Americas. And so as we continue our journey to hearing more hidden stories, we move back across the waters to Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Slavery not only had a stronghold in the South, but also in the North. During the 17th century, Philadelphia was Pennsylvania's primary location for importing Black people to work as domestics, field laborers, and apprentices. The majority of those worked various shipping jobs. In the 1760s, a large percentage of white households, 1 in every 6 in Philadelphia, held at least one Black person in bondage. Pennsylvania was the first state to enact extensive freedom legislation. In 1780, the state passed the Gradual Abolition Act of 1780. After that, Pennsylvania, more importantly, Philadelphia, became known as not for its role in slavery, but its role in freedom. Blacks traveled near and far to Philadelphia, and some remained while others continued on their journey elsewhere. So now, let us hear hidden histories on land, lineage, family life, and emancipation in Philadelphia from Lisa Sharon Harper.
Thank you so much. Such an honor to be here and to share my story. I grew up visiting my grandmother, Willa Jenkins Lawrence, and grandfather, Junius Lawrence, in South Philadelphia, just 1 block from where I live right now. This is where my mother grew up. It's where they lived. It's where my great-grandparents lived. They lived in this community for about 70 years. And now I'm honored to continue the tradition. In segregated 1970s South Philadelphia, I used to visit their home. Children used to play on the streets around here, these really narrow streets that were built for horse carriages, not cars. Children would sit out in the middle of the street playing jacks or double dutch and handball. They would do handball against the walls, or they'd play paddleball. Old timers sat in lawn chairs in front of their houses and talked to each other, calling to each other across the street. Hey, have you seen so-and-so? Are they coming to visit soon? Or joining each other on their front steps. And most of the people in this community that I'm sitting in right now all came north in the Great Migration from the same community in South Carolina, Camden, South Carolina. Most of the people knew each other down in Camden and had been enslaved together on the plantations in that community. As I moved through the streets of Philadelphia, I had no idea that that was true. That was the case. I had no idea that it was ground zero for the abolitionist movement. I had no idea that as a child, that one of the principal financiers of the abolitionist movement was James Forten, a Black man. Hello, yes, a Black man. In fact, when William Lord Garrison wanted seed money to start the Liberator, who did he go to? The first person he went to was James Forten. In David Hackett Fisher's African Founders, Fisher connects James Forten to Fortune Game McGee, my 10 times great grandmother, and the namesake of my book, Fortune: How Race Broke My Family and the World and How to Repair It All. In 1917, Willa's mother, Lizzie, Willa, my grandmother, her mother, Lizzie, who also lived right 2 blocks down, joined the stream of 7 million people of African descent who fled north to escape the terror and the degradation of Jim Crow South. Lizzie had been raised by her grandmother, Leah Ballard, in Camden, South Carolina, along with most of the other people here. Leah was the last enslaved woman in our family. And in my family research for Fortune, I discovered that 1 in 3 children enslaved in South Carolina's Low Country died before their first birthday. 1 in 3 in the area where Leah was enslaved in the Piedmont area, the northern area of South Carolina, would die before their 16th birthday. Leah had 17 children, but only 15 were counted on the census after the Civil War. We believe that the first 5 children either died or were sold away deeper south or were gifted deeper south to family. I'd like to close by reading a section of Fortune about Leah and about the day that she learned that she was free. Leah Ballard Ankrum Williams was a woman for whom the putrid taste of antebellum loss had become familiar. That loss followed Leah throughout the first 19 years, and its ghost haunted her in every generation till the day she died. The same year that Leah gave birth to Martha, her daughter, our nation pushed the 13th Amendment from passage to ratification within 12 months. Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime, whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction, end quote. These words catalyzed the reversal of the original Virginia laws established in 1662, as well as every race law that bound Fortune and her descendants, the laws that bound my great-grandfather Henry and his brothers, and the South Carolina laws that shackled generations of Leah's family and would have bound them forever. I can only imagine Leah's tears and dancing on the day when she learned that she was free. To think of the joy now, my body cannot contain it. Leah would taste loss again, but for this moment, I imagine Leah standing on the land she and her people had slaved for generations. I see her hearing that she is free. She raises her face to the noonday sun. She looks up to the trees, the leaves blowing and swaying overhead. Leah remembers the sound of the spirit songs in the brush arbor. She remembers her mother's voice in the trees. She listens close, and soon she hears the harmonies of her foremothers all the way back to the Yoruba and Hausa women of Nigeria. They sing to her from the trees. Put on your crown, child. Put on your crown. I came this night for to sing and pray, oh yes, to drive old Satan far away. Oh yes, that heavenly home is bright and fair. Oh yes, but very few can enter there. Oh yes, oh wait till I put on my crown. Wait till I put on my crown. Wait till I put on my crown. Oh yes, if you want to catch that heavenly breeze, oh yes, go down in the valley on your knees. Oh yes, go bow your knees upon the ground. Oh yes, and ask your Lord to turn you round. Oh yes, oh wait till I put on my robe. Wait till I put on my robe. Wait till I put on my robe. Oh yes, oh yes.
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. As we continue our journey to hearing more hidden stories, we journey by small vessel from Philadelphia to central Alabama. The U.S. abolished the international slave trade on January 1st, 1808. But that did not stop Americans from smuggling more than 50,000 Black people from Africa to the US. As of date, the last known slave ship illegally transporting roughly 110 Black people docked in Alabama. The ship, as many of you may know, was known as Clotilda, arriving in 1860, 1 year before the Civil War. Over time, the Black people aboard the Clotilda and the ship that brought them had the last word. They built an all-Black town called Africatown, and the ship carrying them was recently discovered. So now let us hear a hidden history on land, lineage, family life, and emancipation in Alabama from Valerie Bridgman.
I am Valerie Bridgman, the daughter of Bernice O'Neill McKinney Bridgman, the daughter of Callie Pearson McKinney, the daughter of, I think her mom was Lizzie White Pearson, who was the daughter of an enslaved woman. And so I think I'm wrong about that. My grandmother's mother came up out of slavery. My grandmother was born in 1884, I believe it was. And she married my grandfather, Kempis McKinney. So they bought a farm, bought land in central Alabama between Sylacauga and Childersburg, Alabama, in not actually in Odina, but 2 miles from Odina, which is a small community between those two very small towns, a farming community. My grandfather had a brother who had a larger farm of orchard of peaches in central Alabama in Clanton, 200 acres. But we grew up living next door to my grandparents on this farm, this 40-acre farm in central Alabama, about 40 miles southeast of Birmingham. In the 60s and 70s. It's when I grew up. My grandfather bought the land back in the 40s, so we're back actually before that. My mother was born in 1924, so he owned the land before then, and I don't know how much before then. I actually don't know that part of our history. The story I want to tell about the land. So we grew up on this land and it was farmed, and we ate from the garden, and the farm was farm to market. So a lot of vegetables, mostly green beans and corn, went to market, and hogs and an occasional cow went to market from that land. It wasn't sustainable for a living. So my grandfather also was the janitor at the local, at the time, all-white school in Sylacauga. And my grandmother was a homemaker and a root worker. So my grandmother was a local healer. People came to her for herbs and healing. And I tell people all the time, and I may be misremembering, but I don't think I am. We were rarely sick growing up because we were given teas and poultices and all kinds of things that were rooted to natural healing that my grandmother did. And she would go into the woods behind the farm on the new moon and cut roots and find leaves and tend to our healing in that way. She didn't talk about that. My grandfather was a deacon of the church, and my grandmother was a mother on the motherboard in a Baptist church. So that part of our life was there, but it was on the edge. Like, we knew it, we experienced it, but nobody ever talked about her as a root worker, as a healer. I think the story that I want to share about that land is in 1954, a meteorite hit in Alabama, in the region, and it hit a woman's house, a white woman's house, not that far from where my grandfather lived. And a piece of the meteorite landed on our land. And my grandfather had the presence of mind to get an attorney. So he got an attorney, and sure enough, people came wanting to him to quote, give them the media right, and he refused. And the Smithsonian or somebody bought the meteorite piece that landed on his land, and it was enough for him to build the house that I remember as a child. So it hit the land in 1954. My grandfather had the presence of mind to get an attorney, and rather than just give the piece to a historical site, he sold it, and it was enough for this house that we grew up in or around. We actually grew up next door in a trailer next to my grandparents' house. 1954, that was his story. I am always struck that he had the presence of mind to get an attorney. I don't know who his attorney was. It was in the Smithsonian for a while. I don't know that it is now, but I remember the first time I went to the Smithsonian in the 1980s, it was still one of the displays and he made Jet magazine. So, that was big. He was in the Jet magazine as a man who had recovered this meteorite on his land. Yeah, so that's the piece of the land story of my ancestry that resonates for me right now. But I've come to value what it means to be a part of a landscape, not to own it as much as to be a caretaker of, and to be part of the ecosystem therein, and to appreciate the land, the foliage, the fauna, all that it means to be a part of all creation. I'll tell this quick story. My grandfather, we would go into the woods and we would take a hoe with us, in case you ran into a poisonous snake, which was quite possible in central Alabama. And he would say to us, if you hear a rattlesnake, just be still, because it's not trying to hurt you. It's trying to tell you it's there and it needs time to get out your way. But if you see a cotton moccasin, you got to chop his head off, So he would teach us how to be in relationship with nature as opposed to being afraid of nature. So I grew up climbing those trees or climbing the side of my grandfather's house, my grandparents' house, and watching the stars. All of that is a part of what it means to be free to me. What it means to be connected to the world in such a way that you can thrive and the world itself can thrive. Fania Davis said to us one time at the Proctor conference that we can't live on rage. And part of what the land does for me, our land where I grew up, is it is a reminder of ancestry. It's a reminder of ancestors. It's a reminder of those people, who brought us here. We are the result of many loves. I can't remember who said it, but I like that notion. We are the result of many loves. And that line in the new Roots where they say, blessed is the ground because my ancestors are in it, right? Blessed is the rain because it blesses the faces of my ancestors, that this land is also the place where people are buried. My people are not buried on our land. They're buried in a cemetery at Harper's Baptist Church. But the notion of the land being sacred because of whose bodies are there, the native to Turtle Island, the indigenous people who owned that land or who were a part of that land before we were a part of that land. And we do have some indigenous ancestry, you know. All of what it means to hold that seriously makes it worth and compelling to fight for freedom, you know, to want for all people to everyone to sit under their own fig and vine, every fig tree and vine, and none be afraid, to quote the prophet, you know. That for me, freedom is having your own fig tree and vine and not being afraid, whatever that may mean. And I think we have enough in the world, certainly in this country, for the level of poverty that we currently experience not to be there.
Wow. Valerie Bridgman, how powerful. When you think of your story and Yvonne's story, they are so interconnected. What a breath for us to take at this moment. There have been a lot of stories, a lot of energy has gone forward, and I'm inviting us to just pause just for a moment. I know time is upon us, but just to exhale, because that was powerful. The value of valuing the landscape. We bless the earth because the ancestors are in it. And we bless the stories that have gone forth. As we continue on our journey to hearing more hidden stories, we migrate from Alabama to the Midwest, to stop to Illinois, and stop at the Windy City, Chicago.
Thank you, Renee. It's a pleasure to be able to share this space with a family member who will tell her story. I am fifth generation. My cousin and I, Cheryl West, are fifth generation, and our matrilineal side is full of DNA from the Yoruba and the Hausa people in Nigeria. But we share rich soil from Durant, Mississippi, and all of us in the family who would go to Durant, Mississippi, we would crowd into this little bitty house that my great-grandparents owned. And when we got off the train, my great-grandmother would beat the tick that she had taken off the bed. The train would get in at about 5:30, and there was my grandmother, my great-grandmother, she's about 5 feet tall, with a broom beating the tick. And then she would go into the house and make breakfast for us. Biscuits and a piece of chicken, and they had this thing called clabber milk in the refrigerator. It was the most disgusting thing I'd ever seen, but it made the biscuits taste so good. But it was the stories that they told us. It was my great-grandmother, Mary Hawkins, and my great-grandfather, Willie Hawkins. And then they gave birth to my grandmother, Lemmy Noy Hawkins. Lemmy Noy could tell a story. She would have us and anyone in the house just laughing. That is what I remember from my ancestors, laughter and love. And my cousin Cheryl West was so inspired by the laughter and the love that she became a playwright. And my great-grandfather sat at the table one morning, took out his teeth and a big file, and as he was just sawing on those teeth, and I said, one day I'm going to tell my stories, maybe be a preacher. And he looked at me and said, God didn't call no woman to preach. Well, Willie Hawkins, here I be, the Reverend Dr. Velda Love. But it is to that courage and those stories that have fueled us in a way that a playwright could take someone's life and make it dance, make it sing, and make it come alive. From Chicago, Illinois, Cheryl Lynn West and Velda Love, born to the Hawkins family.
Speaking of Black families, Illinois in 1848 outlawed slavery and involuntary servitude. The last recorded emancipation of an Illinois enslaved person occurred during the Civil War. After the war ended, Black families like Cheryl's family and Velda's family found refuge in places like Philadelphia, but also Chicago. So much so that Chicago became known as the Black metropolis during the Great Migration, a long-term movement of Black people from the South to the Midwest and North. The largest concentration of Black families resided in the near South Side of Chicago. So now let us hear from Velda's cousin. Hidden story on land, lineage, family life, and emancipation in Chicago, Cheryl West.
I'm Cheryl West. I'm a playwright, born and raised in Chicago and now resides in Seattle. Our family's from Mississippi, has deep roots there. And for me, my grandmother, our grandmother, was such a storyteller. And in our family, if you could tell a good story, we like to see you coming. And my grandmother could hold an entire room by telling a story. She was not a very educated woman in terms of school smart, but mother wit, she had enormous amounts of that. And I used to just love hearing her tell stories. And she got that from our great grandfather, who also was a great storyteller. And so when we would go to Mississippi every year, there was no TV or, we sat around and told stories that had been sort of embellished as years went by. Some of them were a little bit of lies, but they were so entertaining. And I don't think I would be a storyteller if it hadn't been for my great grandfather and my grandmother, because they taught me the value of continuing our stories, our lineage, our family stories. And they were funny, they were humorous, sometimes a lot of pathos. Sometimes, you could tell there was some grief in those stories, but the laughter that would ensue was just wonderful. And I just thought, I want to be that one day. I want to be able to tell the family stories. And so I became a writer, and now that's what I do. And I'm particularly interested in historical figures because I think for me, I feel like we're all on courage journeys. And when I research a true figure from history, they teach me about courage. They teach you about resiliency. They teach you about how to get back up, because the people that came before us, including our family, walked some rough roads, and but they never gave up. And so, particularly as an artist, you're always tempted to give up because it's your living is based on other people's whims sometimes. So, but by having the examples of historical figures, my grandparents, my great grandparents, I know that it's not in me, it's not in my DNA to give up. And they have shown me by the examples of their lives how to keep going. For example, my most recent work is about Fannie Lou Hamer, the music and life of Fannie Lou Hamer. And I was researching another project that had to do with Freedom Summer. And I came across some information about her. I had heard of Fannie Lou Hamer, but I didn't know her like I know her now. And I just thought, when I read about her, I said that would make a very good one-woman play told from her story, her vernacular, because we need hope. We need a way to know how to keep going. And she was the epitome of that. She was such a patriot. She loved America, but she was equal opportunity to say, America, you are failing people. She would also take Black people to task. We could do more. She was so into voting rights and to get out and vote. If you want to make a change, you have to vote. And, her house was dynamited. She was beaten. Her husband couldn't get work, but she did not give up. And she had such courage, such courage. And I so admire her. And this was a play that during the pandemic, when nothing else was getting produced, Fannie Lou Hamer made a way that this play and her voice could keep going. And so we ended up doing it in the parks. We couldn't be inside in theaters, so we did it in the parks in Chicago, working on a show about Sister Rosetta Tharpe, another person who was a trailblazer in music. And for me, she's another person who was at one point shunned by her church that raised her because of the type of music she wanted to do. And she felt like, and that she was also doing it in nightclubs. And she said, but people in nightclubs need Jesus too. So I admire Sister Rosetta Tharpe, and we're doing a musical, which will happen in DC next year. So these are women who have enormous amount of fortitude and resilience, and they're here to show us the way. And my job as a playwright is to channel their voices, to be able to put their stories on stage and say to people who may not know who they are, hey, take a look at these women because they may show you a way in your journey.
Wow. Thank you, Cheryl, for reminding us the value of the story through creative enactments. As we continue our journey to hearing more hidden stories, we cross over 2 states, over to Ohio, with a stop in Cleveland. Ohio prohibited slavery. Aren't we happy to finally hear that? Ohio, I'm gonna say it again. Ohio prohibited slavery, and no one could buy or sell Black people within the state. Throughout slavery, enslaved Black people running from places like Alabama, Louisiana, Mississippi found refuge in Ohio. For some, it was an Underground Railroad pit stop on their way to Canada, but for others, like our next speaker, it was home. The Great Migration quickly increased Ohio's population, especially in areas like Cleveland, which attracted Black people in search of jobs to escape racial discrimination and violence. So now let us hear a hidden story on land, lineage, family life, and emancipation from Cleveland's Thaddeus Elliott.
All right, thank you for that introduction, Renee. So yes, I am Thaddeus Elliott. I am the son of Andrea Burt, nee Andrea Brooks, who herself is the daughter of Ruby Brooks and Layden Brooks Sr. My mother, was the first of her family to be born and raised in the North. My grandmother was originally from Gadsden, Alabama, and my grandfather was from Quitman, Georgia, a small little town in Brooks County, Georgia. The county, fun fact, well, not so fun, but it was named after the Congressman Preston Brooks, the notorious one who caned his fellow senator over abolition of slavery in Congress. And so that is the county for which my grandfather's family gets their name from. And so that's about the history. So both of them found their way. My grandfather, a country farm boy, all of his family members were farmers, landowners in Georgia. They did not share crop, which was always a source of pride for us. He found his way up to Cleveland after my great-grandmother, who worked many years for his early years in his life as a migrant farm worker, married and settled in Cleveland, eventually purchasing 84 acres of land about an hour and a half east of Cleveland in a small little town of Cherry Valley. And my grandmother came from Gadsden by way of Nashville, Tennessee, where she had been to Tennessee State and graduated with a teaching degree. And originally she and her twin sister, my Aunt Ruth, had wanted to go to Chicago, but my great-grandfather would not purchase the ticket for them to go to Chicago. They had to go to Cleveland because that is where he knew people who could look out for his two youngest daughters. So in 1955, my grandmother made her way to Cleveland, Ohio, to get a job as a teacher. And recently I asked her what was her first impression. Oftentimes she had told me Cleveland was just one big old Southern town. Usually she would say that because so many other people were from Alabama, just like her, they had Southern accents like her, they cooked the same food, that they knew a lot of the same people. But this time when I asked her and got that answer back, she changed it up on me and said, Cleveland was just a big Southern town, just as segregated as anywhere I had been in the South up to that point. But it had a little more options. So for her, one of the key differences was going to the movies. She talked about in Gadsden, there was one movie theater and all the Black folk were relegated to sitting in the balcony seats. They could not sit on the main level. That was reserved for white folks. And so you would be stuffed up into the balcony, even if it was overcrowded. But when she got to Cleveland, she could go to the movies and essentially sit anywhere that she wanted to sit. She could enter through the main doors of the department stores downtown. There were no signs marking colored facilities versus white facilities. So there was no maintenance of any sense of boundaries or segregation via Jim Crow, but there were still clear boundaries in terms of where they could live, where they could socialize and really navigate. So the main demarcation point for them, and my mother would talk about this a lot growing up, was the Cuyahoga River. Black folks mostly lived east of the Cuyahoga. They did not venture west of the river. Parma was one area in particular that was notoriously unfriendly to Black people. You did not go to Parma during the day, during the night, unless you worked at the GM factory. And as soon as your shift was done at the GM factory, you had to hightail it out of Parma. On the east side, areas that they didn't really venture into would be Slavic Village. So that's down Broadway near 34th Street. Mayfield and Coventry by Little Italy. Those were some areas that my mother always grew up conscientious of ever venturing too far into, and definitely not venturing into those areas at night. So for my family, my grandmother, and then eventually her siblings joined her there. Their lives were lived in the Huff area. That's where my mother grew up, in a house right off Ansel Road near University Circle. They grew up in the Huff. And then my aunt and uncle lived at varying times off of St. Clair and Superior around 105th and 115th Street East. And that was kind of their domain, their area that they grew and lived and had their lives in. They joined a lot of professional associations, social clubs, went to a lot of cabarets. We have tons and tons of pictures of them at the cabarets, experiencing Black life in Cleveland on the East Side. But over time, as things progressed from their first initial migration in, we started to venture out. Our family migrated into the eastern suburbs. So by the time my mom started working, her first job at the illuminating company, she had a lot of white coworkers that she began to build relationships with, and even got invited to parties and events out on the West Side and North Royalton and places like that. And eventually my mom settled with my older sister, and then I eventually came along. We were living in Shaker Heights, Ohio. which is notably one of the intentionally integrated suburbs that gets a lot of play. My older sister was actually part of a study about why do all the Black kids sit at the one table in the cafeteria when she was growing up in Shaker Heights. And so I grew up in my early years in this integrated, but not quite fully integrated community, having to balance, being Black in this space, kind of sounding like a white person in some people's purview, and trying to negotiate that identity. A key part of that, though, was our involvement with the UCC. My mom became a member of the United Church of Christ at 18 when she and my grandmother and my two uncles joined Euclid Avenue Congregational Church, which is now South Euclid United Church of Christ, which my grandmother still continues as a member of nearly 50 years and has been a moderator and served on every sort of committee imaginable there. And my grandmother especially marks joining that integrated congregation as a turning point in her time in Cleveland, where she really began to create long-term, meaningful cross-racial relationships that really expanded the scope of the city of Cleveland that she saw and experienced and what she thought was accessible to her. Part of this was the instilled value from my great-grandparents, who always taught a message of respect and dignity for all people. We treat everyone with the same dignity that we would like to be deferred to us. And no matter who we are and wherever we live and wherever we are, wherever we find ourselves, it is incumbent upon us to speak up for the voiceless, to hold our heads high and always feel that we have a sense of belonging and that nothing is off bounds to us, not education, not a job, not a place or home to live in. And so we took that spirit, and with that extra grounding in the United Church of Christ, with these relationships, I know recently my grandmother said that now she feels there aren't places in Cleveland where she can't go. That doesn't mean that we still don't have a long way to go, but it is something to say of how much we've been able to come along in that short period from the 50s, especially my mother's and my grandmother's life, having been born into Jim Crow segregation, witnessing a lot of terrors and traumas that she doesn't often speak about, but we know run-ins with the Klan, run-ins on those road trips back from Cleveland down into Alabama, stops where they were chased away from gas stations, ice cream shops, by white owners with guns, denying them service there. It's just amazing to see how far our families come along. Even now, I have family members and cousins who ventured off and they now live in Strongsville. I had a cousin who did live in Parma eventually. So that's only a testament to how far we can go and we can continue to work to realize emancipation for us all in both the North and the South.
Thank you, Thaddeus, for reminding us, though slavery ended, Jim Crow was alive and well, but we kept moving. And as we continue our journey to hearing more hidden stories, we trek westward to Oakland, California. They came with the gold rush. Although California was admitted to the Union as a free state, slavery existed in 1840 and into the 1850s. Outside of the gold rush period, Black families traveled in large numbers, as we said, to Ohio, Illinois, and California. The Golden State, they won the game, by the way. The Golden State provided a fresh start for many Black families. As Bishop Henry Williams, a longtime Oakland, California resident, said, when he left his hometown in Alabama and drove to California, he was only 21 years old with 18 cents in his pocket. But he didn't have a plan, but he knew he had to leave the sharecroppers plantation where his parents, grandparents, and great-grandparents worked. So let us hear now a poem on land, lineage, family life, and emancipation in Oakland from Marvin K. White.
Hello, my name is Marvin K. White. I am the Minister of Celebration at the historic Glide Memorial Church in San Francisco, and I am a member in discernment with the UCC seeking ordination. I'm going to read a passage from my book called Our Name Be Witness, and it's a collection of stories that I wrote with and about the women that I come from. And I want to make sure that I always say that I'm not speaking for these women. These women are speaking through me for these stories. My mom and my grandmother both had Alzheimer's, and I was their primary caregiver, and I listened to their stories. I was raised by their stories, and when they stopped speaking and couldn't tell their stories, I prayed that they would speak to me and through me so I can write these stories down. And so I'm going to share a passage about the kind of matriarch figure in the book based on my grandmother, and what I remember about how women used to come and just sit with my grandmother and come to my grandmother to fix things, and not toasters, but women would come to have my grandmother fix their men. So this is a passage about how my grandmother fixed things. Our name be witness. You want them to leave? You want them to hurt? Or you want them to stay and act right? I don't believe in men hitting on women, not even stupid women. So speak up. I don't believe in women waiting around for apologies or for his self-esteem to grow or for him to get a job or for him to stop feeling like he can't catch no break in the world. Trust me, the break he will catch will be your jaw, or worse, your eye, or even worse, your love. He break that, then you a table without legs, girl. Even if he don't hit you again, he can. And you know he can, and worse, he know he can. It's a hard thing for a woman to stand up straight and at the same time be ducking and dodging blows that ain't even been swung yet. So how you want to play this? You want them gone? Gone? Away gone? Or gone crazy? Dead? Child, dead is easy. In the ground dead or walking dead. Don't be scared now. He opened this jar, and that sorry man didn't even know that he spilled blood, so this is on him. What you mean you don't know? Child, that's a headscarf you wearing, not an invisible shield. You came to me, and I know what I do, and you know what I do. Every eye pretending not to look was looking, and they know. Everybody you thought you heard laughing at you was, and they knew. Hell, your mama knew. And then when she got what she wanted something to tell her to make her forget what she knew. You can go if you want to. Crawl yourself back between his legs, have his babies, light up the whole damn world with them damn near white children. Just know that this is 2008 and not 1908. Time to be present, child. Time to shake some of them shadows following you for generations. Just turn real quick. You ain't the first one of y'all to come to me, and trust me, the whole lot of y'all crazy. Wouldn't hurt my feelings one bit if I didn't see one of y'all for another lifetime. Just 'cause you win it, child, don't mean it's a prize. You gonna toss that nickel in the can or what, girl? I got greens on, and they just about screaming loud enough for me to pour some vinegar down their throat. Good girl. Get your pencil ready. Go to the butcher and pick out the neck bones that speak to you. the ones that know what you've been through. Don't buy no package of neck bones. That's somebody else stuff wrapped up for you. Put the neck bones in a large Dutch oven and cover them with water. Make sure you put the lid on tight and keep them bad boys quiet. Neck bones got too much memory, talk too much, but you know that, don't you? Get 2 ears of corn, half a pound of peas, and half a pound of okra. Buy the frozen packages so he don't think nothing. Get 2 cans of the stewed tomatoes. Get the one with the white women holding a knife in one hand and the carrot by its hair in the other. Lay your seasonings out. Salt, pepper, garlic powder, Lowry's. Mix them together in your spice bowl. Chop up 2 large bay leaves and 2 large yellow onions. Do not let the onions see your weak side. Turn up the heat and cook the neck bones. Add the onions, seasoned salt, and pepper. Lift up the lid only to skim the fat and slime off the meat. Cook until it is so tender that the meat falls off the bones. Leave the bones and the vegetables and the bay leaves and stew for 45 minutes on low heat. If you forget anything and everything else, remember, low heat. You know how to make cornbread from scratch? 20 minutes in, make some. Make sure you got his sweet tea ready too. Don't worry about how I know that. Make sure he blesses the food. Make sure you can see his face through the steam of the neck bone stew. Make sure you see who he looked like in that steam and who you need him to look like in that steam. And tell you what, next time you buy a ticket to some man's magic show, but you don't want to be sawed in half or have a penny pulled from behind your ear, or you can't accept the flowers thinned out of thin air, or you too scared to be disappeared, don't raise your hand when he asks who believes. Act right. Oh, child, he will act right. You just like your mama.
Wow. Snap, snap, double, double. You are just like your mama. But remember the low heat. Thank you so much, Marvin, for that moment. Another moment in the Hush Harbor. We bring our journey to a close and we return to the state where it all began, Texas. Many Black families did not migrate north and west. They remained in the South. And one thing was certain, no matter where Black people found themselves in the world, they were always faced with joy and hardship, discrimination and opportunity, violence and love, hope and intolerance. So as we come to a close, we say what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. We are so happy that what happened in Texas did not stay in Texas. So now let us hear a hidden story on land, lineage, family life, and emancipation in San Antonio, Texas, from Yvette Flonder.
First, my grandfather, my mother's father, who was the son of a mulatto Black woman, a mixed race Black woman, and a white man who took her and raped her. And my grandfather was very what we call fair-skinned. He was fair-skinned. He had really, really, really straight hair, and he had pink feet, which fascinated me because he was the only person in my family that had pink feet. Essentially, in my family, he could pass. He was born in Texas on the route, as he called it, which means he wasn't born in a specific city. And he was born in 1901. And he had the opportunity in his life at that time, close to San Antonio. He called it San Antonio and sometimes Santone, but San Antonio. He had the option to take his pink feet and continue to marry someone else with pink feet and basically disconnect from his Afrocentricity and his African background. But my grandfather chose to connect to his family of origin, particularly through his mother and the siblings that came along after, and be known as an African American, as a Negro. I want to lift that up because it was something he did not have to do, but he chose to do it. And I loved him for it. Eugene Edward Hamilton, who in time became a bishop in the fledgling Church of God in Christ, which began at Azusa Street in 1906. Well, my grandfather came along a little later on, and he was sent by Bishop Charles Harrison Mason, the founder of the Church of God in Christ. He was sent to California to become the bishop of the northern part of California. And my grandfather came during the diaspora from the South, working on the railroad as a cook to take care of his family and settling in San Francisco. My mother said you could go for months and not see a Black person until World War II hit. And when it hit, folks came from the diaspora of the South to work at the railroad and to work at the shipyards and to be cooks on the train. There was a huge diaspora of Black people. Well, my grandfather came before that diaspora. He said the Spirit of God told him to come to San Francisco. My grandmother told him, go right ahead. We'll sit here and wait for you till you come back. Eventually, if you had known my grandmother, you would have known that Mother Bessie Lee Hamilton meant what she said. I can say eventually, she said yes, and they came to California just pre-World War II and established a church, Emmanuel Church of God in Christ. The church is still Emmanuel Church of God in Christ, by the way. And this was just prior to Bishop Mason actually consecrating my grandfather, Bishop. It's important. My mother said you could wait for months and you could see one Black person here and there. And then all of a sudden, they were everywhere, given the World War II realities. I want to lift him up because he is the type. It is so many times that I think about my grandpa, as I call him. He is the kind of person, or was the kind of person, that impacted my life in my family. And there are others. But I celebrate Eugene Edward Hamilton because he pushed back. He pushed back against the status quo. He pushed back against what would have considered him to be special and powerful. He pushed back against the social norms. He pushed back against bad religion. He just continued to push back. And all of his life, that's what he did. And I see him in my memory. I consider myself mid-generation. I remember my grandparents and my parents, and then I have children and grandchildren. And so it's my responsibility to share with them those things from those two generations that have gone ahead of me, the things that they need to know so that they can bless the generations that come after them. I ask myself a question in relationship to my grandfather's experience. And this is connected to Juneteenth and the story of the time that Granger came to Galveston with his regiment and came to let the folks know way long after Massa Lincoln, as they called him, Massa Lincoln, had finished the proclamation of their being no longer slaves. My grandfather's life reminds me of some things that I've reflected on. How do you keep a slave when freedom has actually come? How do people remain with the mind and the heart and the will and the belief that they are intended by the divine to be chattel for other people. How do you do that? And I left a couple of things that I would love to share with you all. First of all, you make them believe that they were not actually slaves, that they were intended by God to be diminished by God's will. It is God's will for them. Freedom does not apply to them. And in many cases, that was what our people were taught. You are 3/5 human. Freedom does not apply to you. Therefore, you should not reach after it. You should not desire it. Just be satisfied with your low estate. It is God's will for you. And the second thing is you keep them from knowing that freedom has actually come, which was what happened on Juneteenth. It was intentional that the slaves were kept not knowing that freedom had come so the crops could come in. Before freedom was announced to them, so that they wouldn't take off and go in a different direction, the crops had to come in. And for almost 2 years, they were kept from knowing. You see, we have to fight this fight continually. Why do we have to fight it? Because even after slavery was abolished, slavery was not abolished. Then it came sharecropping. Then came the prison industrial complex. Then came the diminishment of people, even like my father, who came from the Korean conflict with a GI Bill to find a place to live. And with the GI Bill, he still couldn't find a house because the neighborhoods would not allow Black people to live in them. The diminishment returns over and over again, and we're in it again right now. And I want to say to those who have in their blood the hope and dream of the slaves, and those who have in their psyche the importance of freedom in this country, I want to ask, how much work are we willing to do? So when the arc of justice tries to bend in the right direction and someone continues to snatch it back, what kind of hard work will we do to make my grandfather's sacrifice important, viable, and necessary in the time in which we live? God bless you.
Powerful, Yvette, for reminding us that there's still work ahead. And with that in mind, this work that lies ahead of us, as you said, I see you in my memory. And I say to each of us, as we close our eyes at night, who do we see in our memories? We turn it over now to the panelists for a panel discussion as we bring this to a close. We turn it over to myself and Velda.
So we have just a moment or two, but this is an important question. And panelists, I would like for you to just put your response, if you could, in the chat. And I want to pose this question to our audience because the work of emancipation, racial equity, and full inclusion and justice for all is mandatory if the church is going to thrive in the 21st century. And so my question to you, panelists, and my question to the audience, and even for myself, is what are one or two ways the United Church of Christ congregations can contribute to the movement toward racial justice and emancipation for future generations? As you respond to that question as you take that question with you when we have concluded today's Juneteenth celebration of stories. Hold it. Respond to it in your prayers and in your conversations beyond today, because the church is going to land in the laps, at the feet, and in the hands of the next generation. And we want to be faithful to be sure that the United Church of Christ has the vision and the wherewithal to be part of that movement. I'd like to introduce our Join the Movement curator, Sharon Fenema, who will share some calls to action.
Thank you so much, Reverend Dr. Love. It is an honor to be here today. Join the Movement has at its heart storytelling, stories like these that we've shared and heard today, in part because we know that stories teach us who we are, but also teach us who we can become. But we also hope that the stories that we share and that you encounter through Join the Movement, through events like this, will move you to take action, to respond in some way, to be moved and changed by them. So we wanted to give you some concrete ways that you could respond to these stories. First, we urge you to support HR 40. HR 40 is the Commission to Study and Develop Reparation Proposals for African Americans Act. It would establish an expert commission to study the legacy of enslavement and how the failure to address harm stemming from it have resulted in huge racial disparities between European descendants and African descendants in the United States. For over 30 years, it has been proposed to Congress, but only in 2021 did it actually make it to the floor for full consideration. Organizers are now hoping to put pressure on President Biden to create the commission as an executive order. So we hope you will join them in letting President Biden know that you support this action as people of faith committed to justice, and communicate the same to your congressional representatives. You can join the UCC call to action by clicking on the link that is in the chat. I'm going to put that in right now. Or finding that action link in the Justice and Peace Action Network on ucc.org. Second, we ask you to get involved in supporting Black legacy farmers by joining the Black Farmers Appeal. It seeks to dismantle institutional racial discrimination within the U.S. Department of Agriculture with the following demands: cancellation of all USDA debts for African-descended farmers, full federal and state tax relief, dispersal of funds already awarded to the Pigford class action racial discrimination lawsuit, access to land, and the establishment of a $2.5 billion restorative justice fund to regenerate Black agricultural land base. A link for more information about how to get involved in that is in the chat, or you can find it at acresofancestry.org. And finally, we invite you to join the movement toward racial justice. Join the Movement is an anti-racism initiative and campaign in the United Church of Christ, working for the transformation of racism in our world so that we might foster lives of flourishing for all. You can sign up to receive our action alerts, information, and our newsletter on our website, jointhemovementucc.org. There you will also find more stories to inspire and encourage and challenge you, like the stories we heard today, as well as resources to help deepen your work toward racial justice. Please sign up, make a donation, and join the movement.
Thank you, Sharon. And now we send our panelists and our host into the world to continue to do the deep work of racial justice, of emancipation and liberation. And so this is our benediction. To Dr. Renee K. Harrison, may you continue to expand minds beyond their own understanding and give them the cultural, responsible, historical teaching that has been left out of schools intentionally. Give them the truth and be the truth teller for generations to come. Reverend Dr. Yvonne Delk, you have left us a legacy of being the first African-American woman ordained in the United Church of Christ. And look what God has done because of your witness and your standing and being truth to power. We salute you and we thank you and we honor you because you are a living testimony and a living ancestor. To the Reverend Dr. Bernice Powell Jackson, you are the work of God's hands. You have embodied the voice, the passion, and the commitment to the gospel. You have worked across the lines to make sure that Black farmers and the Immokalee workers are heard. You are right now continuing the work that you began so long ago at the United Church of Christ. Preach, teach, and tell the next generation how we must share the story in the village. We bless you. To Denise and Christine Wiley, the reverends and the doctors, your story transcends the Atlantic and your DNA survived. And so we honor your stories because they are rooted in the God of creation, and you are witnesses to how the church can give birth and life beyond circumstances that would have kept you from being truth tellers in this moment. We thank you. To Valerie Bridgman, Reverend Dr. Valerie Bridgman, you are opening minds beyond their own understanding. You continue to be the womanist scholar that God has placed in your sacred body. You are writing new text. You are telling people to run on and tell it. You are the Habakkuk of this generation. We honor you, Reverend Dr. Valerie Bridgman. Keep doing what you're doing. We see you. To my cousin, Cheryl Lynn West, you write those stories. You tell people what's happening now. You talk about Rosetta Tharpe and Fannie Lou Hamer. Go on back and get the history. Be the Sankofa that we need, because we need to see and hear the good news that comes from your laughter, your joy, and your vision. And to Thaddeus Elliott, you are holding in your body the future of the United Church of Christ. And because you are with us today, we see you being that powerful voice that will carry us both in the political and the public theological realm, that we are standing with you. Solidarity is on your side, and the ancestors will continue to whisper in your ear. To Marvin K. White, you keep telling the story and writing it and making it plain. We heard you, we hear you, and we honor you. To Yvette Flunder, Bishop Yvette Flunder, you don't do anything but tell the truth. And your congregation and people that love you know that you're a truth teller and a truth seeker. We honor you because you know what is happening and why and how we got here. We see you, Bishop Flunder. We honor your life, and we will continue to tell the story because your ancestors gave you everything you need to be who you are in this moment. To all of those who are present and to my curator, Dr. Sharon Finema, we will continue to encourage people to join the movement. We thank you for being part of this Juneteenth celebration. We will be praying with you as you go from this place, but never from God's presence. Take with you the spirit of liberation, the spirit of emancipation, and the spirit of our God. Amen. And thank you.